I found the body on a Tuesday, which I've always thought was an inappropriate day for anything significant to happen. Tuesdays exist to be forgotten. They carry no weight, no ceremony. They are the days you schedule dentist appointments and pick up dry cleaning, not the days that rearrange the architecture of your mind. But the body was there regardless, and it was Tuesday. And nothing I've believed since has managed to hold its shape the way it did before that morning. I was 43 years old, a forensic consultant for the county, which means I'd spent 19 years training myself to see bodies as data. Weight, lividity, temperature differential, the particular grammar of wounds. I was good at it. I was, if I'm being honest, proud of how thoroughly I'd purged the part of me that flinched. The call came at 6:14 in the morning from Detective Rains, with a habit of understatement that I'd always found professionally useful. He said there was a situation at the Hargrove property on Eulalia Road that the responding officers were uncomfortable, and that he'd appreciate my eyes on the scene before the medical examiner arrived. Rains didn't use the word uncomfortable lightly. I drove out in the gray pre-dawn, coffee going cold in the Q folder. The county road cutting through stands of longleaf pine that looked like black stitching against a slightly less black sky. The Hargrove property was a former tobacco farm. The house sitting at the end of a half-mile dirt track, fields long gone to scrub on either side. There were 4 cruisers and an ambulance when I arrived, which was more than Rains's tone had prepared me for. He met me at the edge of the tree line rather than at the house, which I noted. Rains was not a man who loitered at tree lines. He shook my hand, which he also never did. He said the victim was a man named Curtis Aldean, 51, who had rented the farmhouse for 11 months. A neighbor who delivered eggs once a week had found him. I asked what the cause appeared to be, and Rains said he didn't know. And the way he said it stopped me from walking any further for a moment. He said the responding officers had gone inside, seen what was there, and come back out, and that 2 of them had since driven to the far end of the dirt track and were sitting in their cars. I asked if the scene was contaminated, and he said barely. They'd had the sense not to touch anything. They'd just looked and then stopped looking. I went inside alone, which was my preference anyway. The front door was unlocked. The house smelled of mildew and old wood, and something else I didn't identify immediately. Something faintly mineral, like a well. The living room held a folding table, a lawn chair, a floor lamp. The walls were bare. There was no television, no bookshelves, none of the residue of a lived life. Aldean had apparently existed in the house the way a transient exists in a waiting room, touching nothing, leaving as little impression as possible. I moved through to the back bedroom where the officers had told Rains the body was located. Curtis Aldean was seated on the floor with his back against the far wall, knees drawn up slightly, hands resting open on the floor beside his thighs, palms facing the ceiling. His eyes were open. His expression was not one I had a category for. And in 19 years, I had accumulated a thorough taxonomy of the expressions the dead make. Fear, peace, vacancy, pain, the particular slackness of sudden death, I knew them all. What his face held was something I can only describe as sustained attention. The way a person looks when they are concentrating on a sound that is just at the edge of audibility, leaning toward something only they can hear. He had been dead for approximately 36 hours by preliminary estimation, which the medical examiner would later confirm. What I could not confirm, and what I have not been able to resolve in the 8 years since, was what had been done to the room. The walls of the bedroom were covered in writing. Not graffiti, not the frantic scrawl of a disturbed mind, but precise, small, uniform text written in what appeared to be a black marker, covering every inch of every wall from the baseboard to the ceiling, filling the space above the window frames and around the door, and continuing across the ceiling itself in parallel horizontal lines. It was English. It was grammatically correct. It was a single continuous sentence that ran from the bottom left corner of the east wall across every surface in the room, without ever reaching a period. The sentence described in meticulous and affectless language what it felt like to be watched by something that had no eyes and no body and no location, something that existed in the interval between one thought and the next, something that Aldean had apparently first become aware of 8 months prior and had been attempting to document ever since. The writing was dated in small notations at irregular intervals. He had covered the walls across a span of 7 months. He had written for 7 months daily, and the sentence had not ended. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, no underlying conditions, no toxicology findings, no explanation that satisfied me. I stood in that room for a long time. I am a methodical person. I read what was on the walls. I photographed everything. I did not let the situation become something other than a scene. Because the moment you stop treating a scene as a scene, you lose your utility. I was useful. I was precise. I cataloged everything, and I left. In the car, I sat for 11 minutes before starting the engine. What had disturbed me? And what has continued to disturb me with undiminished clarity across 8 years and several hundred subsequent cases was not the writing itself, and not the expression on Aldean's face, and not the 7 months of increasingly compressed text that filled the room like a pressure looking for release. It was that in one notation, dated approximately 3 weeks before his death, Aldean had written a name. He had written it in slightly larger letters than the surrounding text, the only deviation in the entire document from his otherwise rigid uniformity. The name was not mine. I want to be clear about that, because people assume that is where this story goes, and it would be a tidier story if it did. The name was not mine. But it was a name I knew. It was the name of a man I had grown up with, a childhood friend I had lost contact with in my late 20s, a man I had not spoken to or thought about in nearly 15 years. I have not been able to construct a chain of causation that explains how Curtis Aldean, who had no documented connection to me or to anyone in my life, who had lived as a stranger in a rented farmhouse in a county he had moved to from out of state, came to write that name on that wall in that room. I found my old friend 6 months later. It took some effort. He was living in a coastal town 4 states away, working on boats, mostly alone. I drove to see him, which was not a small trip, because I needed to ask him in person whether he had known Aldean, whether their paths had crossed. He said they hadn't. He said he didn't recognize the name. He seemed well. He seemed like the same person I'd known, older, quieter, but intact. I didn't show him the photographs. I didn't describe the room. I had coffee with him and drove home and told myself the connection was coincidental. That in 19 years of forensic work, I had learned that the mind constructs significance from noise because it cannot tolerate noise, and that I should extend the same analytical discipline to my own cognition that I extended to physical evidence. That was 8 years ago. My old friend died 14 months ago. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. No underlying conditions, no explanation. I was not notified directly. I found out through an obituary that appeared in a search I was not expecting to run. His apartment, according to the brief report filed by the responding officer, who was someone I'd never met in a jurisdiction I'd never worked, contained what the report described as extensive written material covering the interior walls. I have requested the photographs. I have not yet opened the files. I am not certain I will. I moved into the house on a Tuesday, which I remember because the moving truck driver mentioned he never worked Tuesdays and that this one felt wrong to him. I laughed. I told him he was superstitious. He carried the last box to the porch, set it down without stepping inside, and drove away faster than I thought a truck that size could move. The house was a 2-story colonial on Eider Street. The kind of property that sells cheap because the previous owners died in it, and real estate law requires disclosure. The old man who lived there before me had been found in the basement 3 weeks after his death. Natural causes, the listing said. Cardiac arrest. I was 34, newly divorced, a high school biology teacher with a budget and no patience for sentiment. I signed the papers the same afternoon I toured the place. The first night I slept on a mattress on the floor of the master bedroom because the bed frame was still disassembled in the truck. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of something dragging across the floor directly beneath me. I lay still and listened. It moved slowly, deliberately, from one end of the room below to the other, paused, and then stopped. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. The pipes contract in the cold and make sounds that travel through the walls in ways that seem almost intentional. I believed this completely and went back to sleep. The second night I heard it again at the same time. The third night I set my phone to record audio and placed it near the bedroom door before I slept. In the morning I listened to 4 hours of silence, and then, at exactly 2:17, a low continuous scrape, like furniture being moved across hardwood, lasting 40 seconds. Nothing before it. Nothing after. I texted my colleague Rena, who taught chemistry and had grown up in old houses. And she said the pipes in her childhood home used to knock so hard they sounded like someone was trapped inside the walls. I accepted this and said nothing more about it. By the second week, I had unpacked enough to feel at home, or at least to perform feeling at home, which I had learned during the divorce was sometimes sufficient. I cooked in the kitchen. I graded papers at the dining room table. I walked through every room in the daylight and found nothing wrong, nothing missing. Nothing out of place except a small rectangular depression in the basement floor where the concrete had been poured differently, smoother, and more recently than the surrounding area. A patch roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. I assumed it was a repair. A crack filled in, a drain covered. I put a shelf unit over it and stacked boxes on top and did not think about it again for 11 days. What made me think about it again was the smell. Not immediately and not strongly at first. Just a faint organic sweetness that rose and fell depending on the temperature. More noticeable on warm afternoons, barely present on cold mornings. I checked for dead animals in the walls. I checked the sump pump. I poured bleach down every drain in the basement. The smell persisted, unchanged. It was not the smell of something rotting. It was the smell of something that had already finished rotting, smell that had moved past decay into something older and more settled. I called the previous owner's son, whose number was still attached to the listing as an emergency contact. He answered on the 4th ring, and when I described the smell, his breathing changed in a way I noticed but did not immediately interpret. He said his father had kept a chest freezer in the basement that had broken down years ago, that perhaps residue had soaked into the floor. He said this quickly and evenly. He asked if there was anything else. I said no. He hung up before I did. The dragging sound continued every night. Always 2:17. Always 40 seconds. Always from the room directly below my bedroom, which was the basement. I began setting an alarm 4 to 10 and sitting at the top of the basement stairs with the lights on. Door open, listening. The sound came through the floor and through the door and through my feet where they rested on the top step. A vibration as much as a noise. And it always ended the same way, not fading out, but stopping. Completely and without transition, as if whatever caused it had simply ceased to exist at the 40-second mark. I am not a person who believes in hauntings. I say this not to establish credibility, but because it is relevant to what I did next, which was practical and empirical. I bought a moisture meter, an infrared thermometer, and a stethoscope from a medical supply website. I mapped temperature variations across the basement floor. The patch of newer concrete was consistently 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. I pressed the stethoscope against the floor at different points and at different hours. During the day, I heard nothing. At 2:17 on a Thursday night, I pressed the stethoscope against the smooth concrete of the patch and heard, faintly and unmistakably, something rhythmic, not mechanical, not pipes. A rhythm I recognized the way you recognize a word in a language you studied briefly 20 years ago. Not with certainty, not with full understanding, but with a cold and immediate physical recognition. I stood up. I turned on every light in the basement. I stood there for a long time and did not hear it again. The next morning, I called a structural engineer named Foley, who came out the following week, walked the basement with a flashlight and a moisture probe, and stopped when he reached the patch. He tapped it with his knuckle. He measured it. He looked at me and asked how long I had owned the property. I told him 6 weeks. He asked if the previous owner had ever mentioned doing basement work. I said I had never met the previous owner. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the concrete in that section was poured over a void, that there was a space beneath it. Not large, not deep, by the sound of it, but hollow. He said it could be an old cistern or a root cellar capped off improperly, common in houses this age. He said I should have it opened and inspected before the foundation was compromised further. He gave me the name of a contractor. I called the contractor. He came out on a Friday. He brought a jackhammer. I stood at the top of the stairs while he worked, and I watched through the open door as he broke the concrete in sections and lifted the pieces away. He stopped working before he was finished. He came to the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me, and he had the expression of a man who has prepared himself many times in his life for moments he hoped would never arrive. He said I needed to call the police. I called the police. 2 officers came, and then more came, and then people in different clothing came, and then the street was full of vehicles, and I sat on my porch in a coat and answered questions for a long time. The man they found beneath my basement floor had been identified by his wallet, which was still on his person. He was the previous owner's business partner. He had been reported missing 11 months earlier. The previous owner's son was arrested 3 days later at an airport in Phoenix. At sentencing, he said his father had not known. I do not know if this is true. What I know is that every night for 6 weeks at 2:17 in the morning, 4:40 seconds, something in that house moved. And I know what the stethoscope gave me on that Thursday night was not pipes, not foundation, not the ordinary grief of an old structure contracting in the cold. I know because I am a biology teacher, and I have spent 20 years learning the vocabulary of living systems. And what I heard through that instrument pressed against that warm and hollow floor was what I have heard in 1,000 classrooms with 1,000 students, leaning forward in their chairs. The sound that moves through every living thing. The sound we spend our whole lives making without once thinking to stop. The sound that only becomes remarkable in the precise and terrible moment we finally hear it somewhere it cannot possibly be. I moved into the house on Ellery Street on a Tuesday in November, which I mention only because the movers told me they never worked Tuesdays, that their boss had a rule about it, and they'd made an exception for me at double the rate. I didn't ask why. I was 34, recently divorced, and the house was cheap enough that I could pay cash and still have money left for furniture. That was the whole calculation. The house had been empty for 11 months, according to the realtor, a woman named Sandra who shook my hand once and never answered my calls after the closing. The previous owner had died inside. Natural causes, she said. Old age, I didn't press it. Old people die in houses all the time, and the houses go on standing without any drama, without any obligation to the living. I believed that. I still believe it, technically. What happened had nothing to do with him. I'm almost certain of that now. Asterisk, the first week was ordinary. The heat worked, the pipes groaned a little but held, and I slept well for the first time in 2 years. My ex-wife had been a light sleeper who woke at the smallest sound and woke me with her waking. And the years of that had left me with a kind of hypervigilance that I'd carried into every room I entered. But in that house I slept through the night, deep and without dreams I could remember. And I woke feeling like a man who had been ill for a long time and had finally, quietly recovered. I thought the isolation was helping. I thought I was healing. I set up my desk in the small room at the back of the second floor, facing the yard. And I worked on the translation project I'd been contracted for. A collection of short fiction from Hungarian that I'd been dragging through for 8 months. I made real progress that first week. I ate simple food. I went to bed at 10. I was, I thought, finally living correctly. The sound started on the 8th night. I don't want to call it a knocking because that word carries too much with it. Too many ghost story associations, and what I heard was not quite that. It was closer to a settling, a weight shifting somewhere in the structure of the house. Except that it was rhythmic, in a way that settling never is. 3 beats, then silence. 3 beats, then silence. It came from below me, from the direction of the kitchen or the hallway between the kitchen and the basement door. I lay in bed and listened to it for what felt like a long time, and then I got up and went downstairs with my phone for the flashlight and found nothing. The basement door was locked from my side. I had the only key. The kitchen was empty. The sound had stopped. I went back upstairs and fell asleep easily, which I now find strange. Because a man who has just heard something unexplained in his house at 2 in the morning should not fall asleep easily. But I did. It continued for 3 more nights, and on the 4th night I called a contractor I found online. A man named Breckett, who came and looked at the floor joists and the pipe runs and told me it was probably thermal expansion. That old houses moved at night when the temperature dropped, and charged me $400 for the visit. The sound that night was louder. 5 beats. Then silence. I timed it on my phone, approximately 40 seconds between each sequence. I lay there timing it, and I thought about how thermal expansion does not keep time. And then I tried to think about something else. I was not frightened, exactly. I want to be precise about this. I was alert in the way you are when something is wrong, but you cannot identify what. Like the moment before you realize you've left something important behind. That hovering sense of incompleteness. That was what I felt, not fear. Not yet. The basement door was a problem I'd been putting off. It opened onto stairs that went down to a space I had looked at once during my walkthrough with Sandra. A low-ceilinged room with a concrete floor and exposed insulation in the walls and a workbench. Along one side with old tools still hanging above it. The previous owner's tools, which Sandra said were included in the sale. There was a chest freezer in the corner. Sandra said it worked, but I'd never turned it on. I had no reason to use it. I was one person eating simple food, and the freezer compartment in the kitchen refrigerator was more than sufficient. I had not been back down to the basement since moving in. This was not a decision I made consciously. It was the kind of avoidance that operates below decision, below articulation. Something the body does before the mind signs off on it. On the 13th night, I went down. The sound had been going for an hour and a half, and I had not slept, and finally something in me resolved. And I took my phone and my flashlight and the key, and I unlocked the basement door and went down the stairs. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Concrete floor. Exposed insulation. The workbench with the old tools hanging in their outlines, traced in marker on a pegboard. The kind of organization that speaks to a personality I never had. The chest freezer in the corner. It was running. I could hear it, a low mechanical hum beneath everything. And I understood then that it had always been running. That it had been running for 11 months while the house sat empty. Drawing power, maintaining whatever temperature it was set to. I stood in the middle of the room and listened and the rhythmic sound was gone, replaced only by that hum. I almost went back upstairs. I was at the foot of the stairs with my hand on the railing, and I almost went back up. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. Because there is a version of this story where I make a different choice at that moment and everything is different. And I am not writing this from the place I am writing it from now. I turned around and I walked to the freezer and I opened it. Asterisk, there was food inside. Not a body, not what you are thinking, nothing like that. There was food, carefully wrapped in butcher paper and labeled in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Labeled with names I didn't recognize either, first names only. In a sequence that had no logic I could determine. The packages were stacked with a precision that told me someone had arranged them thoughtfully, with care. There were perhaps 30 packages. Some of the labels had dates on them going back several years. The oldest one I found was dated 6 years ago. I stood there reading the labels, and I thought about the old man who had lived in this house for decades, who had died here of natural causes, of old age. And I thought about the handwriting on the labels, which was careful and deliberate, and I thought about the names. And I thought about the fact that there were more first names here than a person accumulates in a natural life. I closed the freezer. I went upstairs. I locked the basement door. I sat at my desk until the sun came up, and then I drove to the police station on Carver Avenue. And I told them what I had found, and they went back to the house without me. I never went back. I'm writing this from a motel 3 towns over that takes cash and doesn't ask questions. And I have not slept since that night in the basement. Not really, because every time I close my eyes, I see the labels. And what I cannot stop thinking about. What keeps arriving in my mind, no matter how many times I push it away, is not the packages themselves, but the freezer's hum, steady and constant, running faithfully through 11 months of vacancy, as though it had been waiting, as though it had always known someone would come.